far as eco-criticism is concerned, I've so far dealt with it mostly from the eco-feminist perspective, which is going to be the topic of the next presentation. I'm really looking forward to it. And I wrote mostly on fairy tales by Croatian storyteller Ivana Brlić-Mažuranić, who lived in the first decades of the last century, and also about the work of a Zagreb-based independent feminist group, Four-Handed. But today, I'm afraid, I'm going to play the role of the devil's advocate. The focus of my presentation is the play Kyoto. Functioning? Already? By Joe Murphy and Joe Robertson, first performed by the Royal Shakespeare Company at the Swan Theatre in 2024 and transferred to the Circle Place Theatre in the West End in 2025. The play dramatizes the 10-year negotiation process that led to the so-called Kyoto Protocol, which was agreed in 1997 after a series of United Nations climate conferences. Although Kyoto belongs to a whole recent turn in British political drama of ideas, i.e. dramas that, according to Ellen Redding, lay emphasis on argumentation and reflection rather than quick action, the play is far from unsettling traditional drama and the inherited registers or conventions of performance to address the incommensurability of the ecological hyper-object, as Una Chowdhury suggests that the environmentally conscious, as she calls it, drama of bad ideas does or should do. On the contrary, according to Kyoto's most enthusiastic critics, the play has a certain appeal because it is a genuine thriller that even seems to want to inspire optimism while debunking illusions about perhaps incremental but nonetheless significant progress in global environmental policy. My argument is based on three crucial points. Firstly, although I am aware that Kyoto is not one of the most daring eco-dramaturgical experiments, but rather one of the commercially oriented theatre projects, I have chosen it because I have recently been interested in discovering crucial features that could mark this new deliberative turn in contemporary dramaturgy and could connect it with what I've called in my proposal a perennial dramaturgical matrix, or a subgenre of drama characterized by either representing or actually triggering a process of collective discussion that eventually leads to political moves or decisions on matters of public interest. Historical examples of such a subgenre are not hard to find and range from Aeschylus' Eumenides and Aristophanes' Assembly of Women to more recent ones such as Joël Pomeran's Ça ira fin de lui, or even the hit film Conclave. Kyoto differs from most contemporary environmental theatre pieces precisely because, just like the truly immersive performance World Climate Conference by Rimini Protocol from 2014, or the piece COP Make It Work by Bruno Latour and Philippe Ken from 2015, the play refuses to address climate change from the position of a passive and powerless observer or even victim, immobilized by their helplessness in the face of this overwhelming, uncontrollable and unrepresentable sublime, and instead chooses to question the use of active and efficient human management of this threat, even if only in the form of a deliberative practice that takes place at the highest level of global decision-making. However, in contrast to the post-dramatic pre-enactments by Rimini Protocol and Théâtre Nanterre Amandier to the actual 2015 Paris Climate Conference, both of which involve the audience in the ultimately all too unmanageable reality of the delegates negotiating an agreement that corresponds to the major goals of their respective countries, Kyoto is not only a fictional, but also a historical play. For all the critics' praise for the immersive nature of its first performance, it is clear from reading the play that it follows a much more traditional path of dramatic docu-theatre, from thoughtfully researched and written play to active production, which is about not inhabiting the role of people who are actually in a position to change global climate policy, but imagining it, taking a step back and reflecting on it. In the latter respect, and despite the invitation to the audience to take a seat in the recreated theatre of the UN General Assembly, right next to the actors playing the delegates, the play is thoroughly Aristotelian. It presents, to quote Andreas Engelhardt's bemused admonition in the face of contemporary German post-humanist environmental theatre, actors in roles that involve action. For those who act bear responsibility, and if they have acted wrongly, carry the burden of guilt. The characters in Kyoto are faced with such age-old ethical decisions. They are not, as in the two aforementioned interactive performances, empty masks for well-meaning so-called ordinary citizens or Latour and Ken's Sciences Po students who are supposed to blindly follow the given instructions and accept their role-playing in the world of a simulated future climate conference, but fictional beings interpreted by professional actors. These beings live in the world of an actual historical conference where they represent actual people who could have either deliberately delayed and derailed the negotiations on reducing the carbon footprint, or they could have encouraged the adoption of policies that would have led to a cleaner environment and a fairer share of the obligations related to climate change and its devastating consequences. Hence my second point, that is my interest in the human ecology of Kyoto's dramatic situations, i.e. in the interactions that constitute the specific social ecosystem, with its rules of behavior, its inclusions and exclusions, and its capacity to reconstitute pre-existing micro-social norms, a kind of capacity, incidentally, that was denied to the audience in the supposedly highly interactive works I mentioned earlier. In the fictional world of Kyoto, however, in one of the play's pivotal moments, it turns out that a group of delegates from undervalued, powerless nations within the UN, who are, of course, potentially the most affected by rising sea levels, are not only compelled but also empowered to exercise this ability from a historic alliance of small island states and challenge the behind-the-scenes machinations of influential global actors who are portrayed as relentless champions of their own economic and ideological interests at the expense of the avowedly insubstantial number of people living in the Caribbean and Pacific islands. As theories of democratic deliberation have recently revised some of their central assumptions precisely with regard to distinct dramaturgy of deliberation and a deliberative ecology, implying the identification of fluid, complex, dynamic and unpredictable features that affect webs of interdependence that simultaneously support and constrain social entities at a given moment in time, it is more than appropriate to look at how Kyoto shows that attempts to deal with the prospect of natural environmental catastrophe should also be seen through the lens of this second kind of ecology, the one that hopefully enables people to work together to prevent the worst. In view of the fact that recent developments in the United States have unfortunately shown the extent to which the evasion of responsibility for the environment is ensured by a blatant disregard for democratic procedures, if not by the abolition of the idea of democracy as such, that very form of political life from which the institution of theatre has emerged, it is perhaps quite interesting, among other avenues of investigation, to look at the play that addresses precisely the inextricability of the democratic debate, not only from the desired salvation of the environment, but also from the operative elements of a theatrical representation. Although the two previous post-dramatic experiments on audience involvement in the procedural mechanisms of COPs, Conference of the Parties, were to some extent guided by the same idea, I will try to argue in the larger version of this paper that it is precisely the anti-representational attitude that these experiments promote that prevented them from truly engaging with the above-mentioned consubstantiality. If one believes the critical accounts of the participatory shortcomings of these assembly performances, and even, as Michael Haas argues, their disregard for their own energy expenditure, these two projects seem to have provoked what Benjamin Bennett, in his critique of some, there is no slide. in his critique of post-dramatic theatre, calls a kind of automatic consensus to the rules of their game. And it is only logical, since no personal involvement of the audience was actually desired, only the playing of a socio-political role. People mostly sat quietly and listened to the information that environmental experts conveyed to the public, and had no real time or opportunity for friction and confrontation. Kyoto, on the other hand, as I will show shortly, dispensed with didacticism for all its representation and unreality, and confronted the audience with the very human embodiments of the opposing positions by having the actors carry out the necessary impersonations, i.e. demonstrating the performative style and body language of the people taking part in the deliberations, showing how they present and stage their arguments, how they reach the various listeners and win them over. Deliberation is never only about the content that is being discussed, nor only about the role that is assigned in the given political landscape, but also about the constitutive unpredictability of its outcome. In the case of Rimini Protocol's pre-enactment, for instance, the audience, which was invited to participate in the deliberation process, never really had any influence on its development. My third point relates therefore to the concept of democracy and the paradox of form and content Kyoto makes us confront when we compare the play's topicality to the democratic aspirations of post-dramatic deliberative dramaturgy. To be sure, the intergovernmental level of decision-making during climate change conferences does not imply democracy as a form of government, but it does imply a democratic process, debate and voting, as a prerequisite for the formulation of a policy in question. Given the current theoretical and artistic critique of democratic procedures and the rejection of the goal of political consensus as undesirable stasis in favor of what Jacques Rancière, in a slight variation on Derrida's messianic invocation of a démocratie à venir, calls dissensus, a kind of constant unsettling of the boundaries of the political in order to include more and more people in it, the difficult question of Kyoto is the following. What about issues like climate change, which literally cannot wait for a démocratie à venir, and which simply urgently need a global consensus of those responsible? While formally deploying the dramatic conflict that any truly democratic deliberation must entail, Kyoto also demonstrates the potential perniciousness of such an open-ended approach to democracy for the only viable strategies for achieving environmental goals. It uses the traditional dramatic form of frictions and confrontations of the interested parties in order to precisely show how the procedural aspect of the ongoing deliberations can be abused and distorted to endlessly postpone the realization of a much-needed agreement into the indefinite and increasingly uncertain future, so that fossil fuel lobbyists and profitable industries can carry on business as usual. On the surface, Kyoto follows an exciting but fairly straightforward narrative, which, as the advert proclaims, is full of twists and turns in a strict chronological order. It begins with the moment when Ronald Reagan ends his presidency, having, it seems, also ended ideological bipolarity for good by publicly calling on and persuading Gorbachev to tear down the Berlin Wall. Unfortunately, around the same time, a scientific discovery of man-made climate change darkens the bright prospects of unbridled capitalist triumph. The play begins to trace a 10-year-long, painful saga of negotiations that take place during a series of UN climate conferences, a saga that is crowned by a happy ending, a final agreement signed in 1997 under the solemn aegis of a beacon in human history. However, the audience is confronted with a much more complex temporal and ontological structure that aims at a multi-level dramatic irony. The comically incongruous Brechtian narrator of the story, who, as we learn later, is in fact already dead at the beginning of the play, is none other than the demonic defender of fossil fuels himself, the American lawyer Don Perlman, Reagan's former energy advisor. He addresses the audience from the vantage point of his metaphysical position in the present moment, which he calls the age of disagreement, from which we will soon descend into the more promising 1980s, when Don was recruited by Seven Sisters, the Macbeth-like consortium of old oil companies, to act as a kind of mediator during the upcoming climate conferences, or to be more precise, to spy on their interests in the guise of the phantom CEO of the Climate Council and advisor to the Saudi Arabian delegate. Perlman is aware that he is the last dramatic figure with whom any environmentally conscious inhabitant of the earth can identify. He patronizingly addresses the audience with a retrospective knowledge of a reliable witness and guides them through all stages of the negotiations, intervening time and again to comment on the unfolding scenes and expose the strategies he has employed to obstruct the agreement. He is the only one allowed to move from the backstage, where he is involved in high-dollar intrigues with the nations involved in the oil trade, to the front stage, where he acts as an extremely shrewd participant in the COP debates, forcefully undermining any setting of concrete targets and timetables that would commit the powerful nations to reducing their gas emissions. In this way, a double, historical and diegetic, ironic distance is created for the audience, even though they share the same space with the actors acting as UN representatives. In addition to this obvious analogy between the spaces of theatre production and theatrical representation on the one hand, and the dynamics of covered conversations vis-à-vis public policy on the other, the play also insists on parallels between dialogic interaction and the deliberative practice of policy making, as it focuses on the medium of language, as a means of communication, representation, manipulation, and not least, as a provisional binding force for the parties involved. The representatives engage in a vaudeville-like exchange of politically predictable jibes, reflecting the balance of power in the global landscape, with the US and China as the main ideological and economic adversaries, Europe, i.e. Germany, as the conscientious crypto-leftist eco-activist, and the aforementioned small island states, the first to disappear from the face of the earth, trying to stand out and protest against the irresponsibility of the powerful. In contrast to the predominantly anti-logocentric and materialistic tendencies, tendencies of today's ecological theory and art, in this play, the whole question of agreeing on a common strategy that reduces the risks of planetary catastrophe on the one hand, and satisfies divergent economic, social and political interests on the other, proves to be primarily a struggle for the right expression, the right word, the right length and structure of a sentence in the declaration. So it turns out that every utterance in the negotiation process must be controlled, I quote, down to the last comma, as one of the interested lobbyists warns Don Perlman, while exhorting him to do his best to keep the unwanted phrases bracketed for as long as possible, because to unbracket them on the instructions of the convention's assistant chairman, Raul Estrada, is to ensure their collective acceptance and thus unleash their binding potential for the future. The more heated the debate over seemingly innocuous phrases or the change of tense from would to could to will, the more exhausted the representatives become, or the more stubbornly they refuse to give up the negotiation. After numerous crisscrossing friendly and not so friendly fires are exchanged and unpredictable alliances are reorganized under newly emerging diplomatic conditions and blackmail, the chairman's compromise solutions are suddenly accepted and the agreement is finally adopted unanimously. However, there is another private area behind the stage of this public and globally influential deliberative stage, namely that in which Shirley Perlman, Don's wife, is introduced. A conventional, moderately liberal and private rather than public feminist, she is a naive bystander who follows her husband around the world, mindlessly accepting his cynical explanations of the state of the world in the secret hope that one day he will take her on a well-deserved holiday in a glamorous resort. As opposed to the critics who consider the choice of the anti-hero Perlman as protagonist and narrator to be a stroke of genius on the part of the two playwrights, I would say that the latter applies much more to the decision that Shirley becomes increasingly aware of the true scope of the whole environmental issue and is therefore given the last word in the play. It is she who, at the end, callously informs us of Don's death from lung cancer, most likely caused by his careless unwilling to stop smoking, Another symptom, one might surmise, of his indifference to the scientific warnings about the effects of not only global but also self-inflicted air pollution. When the character of Don Perlman patronizes the audience at the beginning by using derogatory terms for a certain type of theatre-goer, calling them youth theatre, artsy, liberal types who pay your bills in empathy, end of quote, making fun of the hypocrisy of all upper middle class alibis, it is precisely Shirley, the model, conscientious, frivolous bourgeoise, who rounds off the irony of the play in her final monologue, not only by once again making an implicit connection between the UN building, the theatre, and the world, but also comparing herself to the female lion, which, as the audience learns, lives twice as long as the male. I wonder what the female lion does for half her life. Why am I listening to someone I don't know, talking about someone I don't like? The world is full of people we don't know and people we don't like. I look around at the world today and I'm terrified. We're all drifting further and further apart, speaking completely different languages, and the interpreters have well and truly left the building. Meanwhile, the cherry blossom in Kyoto falls earlier each and every year. But you know, even though America didn't ratify the protocol, Raoul had organized it in such a way that it would come into force, with or without them. Most countries met their targets. Many even exceeded them. It was a small step towards